Thank you, Jeremy, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for making it after last night's disco. I must apologise for my voice, which has got nothing to do with last night's disco, but I hope you can hear me all right. So I was asked to talk about Monitor's role in service reconfiguration, but I know the theme for your conference is integration, so I thought I'd link the two as Jeremy suggested. So let me start with integration first. Now, I'm sure I don't need to go through why we need to integrate services better. I'm sure you've already had many discussions about that. Of course, there is an issue as to exactly what do we mean by the integration of services, and I'm sure you've also been discussing that. Of course, it is fundamentally about joining up services better. That therefore begs the question, well, what is it that we need to join up? And in a sense, I think the answer is everything. We need to join primary and secondary care better. We need to join physical and mental health care better. We need to join health and social care better. We need to join up not only between organizations, but even within organizations. So there's a lot of joining up to be done. There are issues, of course, about how all of this is funded as well. In an ideal world, I think we'd even be joining up the funding of healthcare, of social care, and even of areas such as prevention. So there's a lot of opportunities for better integration. In terms of exactly what that looks like, I think we are very clear. People like yourselves need to work that out. I think there is a general acceptance, increasing acceptance, that it is about joining up services around an individual, not around specific conditions or specific specialisms. So, how should services be reconfigured to achieve that better joining up? Well, at a minimum, I think it can be about better information exchange between the different bodies providing different services, and I don't think we should at all understate that. There's huge scope, I think, for simply getting the information about, for example, an individual patient flowing better between the different bodies involved in their care. Beyond that, we can look at alliances or networks of providers. Beyond that, you could go to actual contractual relationships, contractual integration, if you like, between providers. And one idea which I think is rightly gaining currency is the idea that what commissioners might do is contract with a prime contractor, and that they in turn would then subcontract to a set of further providers who provide between them all the care that's needed, and that the contractual relationships make sure that you get the appropriate joining up. Of course, you can go a stage beyond that. You can even get organizational joining up. That might be in the form of a joint venture constructed for the specific purpose of providing integrated care, for example, to a particular population. It might even go beyond that to the full and complete integration of different organizations. We've seen a lot of that, of course, with the TCS transactions. I'm sure we'll see more, although it is an area where I think we need to be cautious. The history of successful mergers and acquisitions, both in the public and in the private sector, is frankly not great. It needs to be done very carefully to be successful. So, what are some of the implications of this? Well, I suspect one implication is that, frankly, the role of the hospital in the healthcare system, or more broadly in the care system, is going to diminish. And we're already talking, of course, we have been talking for some time about the idea of taking care out of hospitals and putting it back into the community, treating people, for example, in their own homes. Some even talk about the notion of providing integrated care to members, to individuals, with only perhaps occasional medical input. And certainly, as you expand the definition of what it is we're trying to integrate, then more and more, I think that is potentially the case. It probably requires as well, to get this sort of integration, some restructuring of primary care. I think almost certainly the current trend towards larger practices needs to continue. The notion that you have practices offering a broader range of services, including services which are much better interfaced with hospitals. We know very well, for example, the problems created in hospitals, the so-called bed blocking, when there is poor integration or coordination between the hospital and those providing care outside the hospital. Now, these sorts of changes, I think, are also being driven by other forces that are at work on this sector. So we know, for example, that NICE guidelines and even the European Working Time Directive is driving hospitals to concentrate the provision of certain services. We know that they need to look at ways of reducing admissions, reducing length of stay in order to address the productivity challenges they face. So all of this is driving towards the need for various sorts of reconfiguration. The FTN recently did a survey of senior NHS managers, 90% of whom said that they thought some significant service reconfiguration was going to be needed within their local health economy over the next couple of years. One of the things I think is important, therefore, as we face what in many ways you could call a burning platform, the productivity challenge in particular is a very serious challenge for the sector. We know about the 20 billion that we have to save by 14-15, but it won't end there. I think we can reasonably assume that the best the sector is going to do for some time will be around flat real terms funding, whilst demand and costs are rising much faster than that. So the productivity challenge is going to be with us for a long while. That creates something of a burning platform. I think one of the things we need to do is to make sure that we exploit that burning platform to get on with some of the sorts of integration that, again, frankly, some people have been talking about for a long while. So what is our role at Monitor in this sort of reconfiguration? Let me start by reminding you what is our duty under the new legislation as we take on this broader sector regulation role. The duty is to promote and protect the interests of people who use healthcare services by, one, promoting the provision of services that is economic, efficient, and effective, and two, by maintaining or improving quality. Now, this is very central to what Monitor is going to be asked to do, and the key bit for us is about protecting and promoting the interests of people who use healthcare services. In other words, when we are thinking about what sorts of things we should be doing, what sorts of decisions we should be making, our starting point and our finishing point should always be what decision is going to be in the best interests of the people who use healthcare services. Now, we have three other secondary duties. One is about ensuring the continuity of services, and this is to deal with situations where the providers of services get into difficulty, making sure that those services are still available for the people in the provider's local community who need those services. We have a duty to prevent anti-competitive behavior where that's not in the interests of patients. And we have a duty to enable the provision of integrated care. So that's in there as one of the things that we quite explicitly have to focus on. Notice in our case, it's about enabling the provision of integrated care. Others have duties in this area as well. The Commissioning Board has a duty to promote integrated care, and I think that quite rightly reflects the fact that very much this is something that needs to be driven by commissioners. Health and Wellbeing Boards have a duty to encourage the provision of integrated services, and the government is looking at giving local authorities a duty also to promote the integration of care and healthcare services in the forthcoming bill. So lots of different bodies with a role to play, and I think one of the very important features of the new system that the Health and Social Care Act has set up one of the very important features is that we all have to work together if we're going to make this work, if we're going to deliver the benefits that I think we all agree are needed. Our role, though, is focused on providers. It's focused on providers and the interactions that go on around them, particularly their interactions with users of the service and their interactions with commissioners. To do this, we have three, in simple terms, three basic tools. We can set rules and enforce them. We can provide incentives, for example, in the way we set prices, and we can require information to be made available. And as I hinted earlier on, I think that will prove to be a very powerful tool if we can find effective ways of deploying it. There are a number of ways in which these duties and the functions that we have to go with them impinge on the issue of reconfiguration. Pricing is one of them. So as we think about how we can use pricing, which we will be doing jointly with the Commissioning Board, as we think about how we can use it, one of the things we can do is to see whether we can create incentives to encourage configuration, the right sort of reconfiguration of services. In relation to our role at Foundation Trusts, and of course the government's objective is that all major providers of care will become Foundation Trusts in the not too distant future. In our relationship with Foundation Trusts, where of course much of the reconfiguration needs to start, there are various things that we can, and indeed I think we must do. One of the most important, I think, is doing what we can to encourage the Foundation Trust to think in advance about the forces that are at work on them and plan for the sorts of reconfiguration they need. I think there is a risk that although we face this burning platform, it'll only be when the flames are licking around people's toes that they will face up to the reality of the sorts of changes they need to make. Of course, in an ideal world, they would have seen them coming and planned in advance, and I think we have a role to play in trying to encourage them to do that. If, however, they don't and they get into difficulty, for certain, one of the things we are very focused on these days is asking the question right up front, even if it looks like a fairly limited problem, even if it is fundamentally a quality problem that a provider faces. We ask the question, to what extent does this reflect some underlying need to reconfigure services? Because we are seeing increasing number of providers who are faced with sometimes quite limited problems. As they try and fix those problems, they realize that to do so, they actually do need to make some fairly fundamental changes to their services. So we want to do what we can to get that recognized early on. Sometimes I think we can play a role in trying to facilitate that, because we all know how difficult it can be. So in fairness to those providers who perhaps have not started to tackle these challenges as early as we would like, it is very difficult. And in truth, they don't always get the support that they need for making the changes that they need to make. Now, I think commissioners have a huge role to play here, not only in setting out what sort of changes you think are needed to support your communities, but also in supporting the providers as they consult on those changes and then start to make them. Now, as I say, we can, to some extent, try and help in that respect. So, for example, Med-Staffs, which is a hospital that clearly needs to work out how it sustains itself in the longer term, we have now sent in a team to work with the hospital, with local commissioners and other bodies to see what the right sort of solution will look like in the longer term. I'm sure we'll be doing more of that in other settings in the future. But the key thing is then to get the full support of commissioners as and when we have to do it. If none of this works, of course, we will find ourselves with some providers who have essentially failed. They've become insolvent. They can't pay their bills. And at that point, under the new regime, a special administrator can be sent in. This has happened in South London, which is not a Foundation Trust, but is essentially the same process. It can happen with FTs. I hope we can avoid that wherever possible. That may be a way of reconfiguring services which has proven very difficult to do under other circumstances, but then it has been done against the clock. Then you've got a hospital that may be losing significant amounts of money, and in a way it's a bit late to be trying to look at innovative new ways of integrating services if we're doing it against that sort of background. So I think it's very important that we and everyone else involved do what we can to anticipate in advance where the problems are likely to lie. In terms specifically of the provision of integrated services, what sort of things can we do? Well, as I say, we can ask a special administrator to look at that as the sort of options they consider in the situation where a hospital trust has failed, but I would like to see it happening sooner. We can, at the opposite end of the spectrum, have in our license conditions, and we've proposed in our license consultation, which is just completed, we've proposed a condition of this sort, which explicitly requires an appropriate cooperation of providers with each other and with commissioners. The condition is couched in very general terms. It's essentially saying that providers shouldn't be doing things which obstructs the integration of services in a way that is of benefit to patients, and then that gives us quite considerable freedom to examine specific situations and to act where we think providers are behaving unreasonably. As I mentioned, there are things we can do in pricing. So we can remove barriers that exist in the current pricing system. And I know people are concerned that some of the current pricing arrangements actually obstruct effective integration of services. One of the things we are doing is really looking at the pricing arrangements, starting with a clean sheet of paper. And I think that's necessary because, frankly, the current arrangements evolved from a different objective to the one that we're asking them to fulfill now. But the problem is it takes a long while to change the pricing system. Once you've decided what you want to do, you have to collect cost data that supports that. There's a lot of improvement needed in that cost data. You then analyze the data, work out what that means for prices, appropriate amounts of consultation, then finally you can change the tariff. This is a period of many years. So we're going about it systematically and rigorously. We're working hand in hand with the commissioning board on this, but it will take a while. So one of the things we in the commissioning board will do is try to help people understand what freedoms you do currently have under the current pricing system, and I think they are greater than people realize. It is not as constraining, the PBR system is not as constraining as I think people imagine. And then finally, I think an important area, because I know this is very much on many people's minds, is the issue of what role choice and competition plays in all of this. As I mentioned, we have a duty to prevent anti-competitive behavior where that's not in the patient's interest. I don't think there has to be a fundamental conflict between choice and competition on the one hand and the provision of integrated services. But the fundamental is this point that whatever we do, whatever you do, has to be in the best interest of patients. If you can demonstrate, if it's clearly the case that what you're doing is in the best interest of patients, then that shouldn't fall foul of the sort of rules that we are going to be putting in place. So that's a very brief overview, but I'll leave it at that and then I think take some questions.